Hello, everyone. Books with Banks back again, and I'm so happy today to be joined by Dr. Daniel Creed. Hello, how are you?
Doing well, Alex. How are you?
Doing great, doing great. And do you prefer Dr. Creed, Dan? What's your preference?
Dan is fine.
Okay, okay. All right. So for everyone watching, Dan and I had the pleasure of meeting Dan along with a bunch of other wonderful professionals at this year's ICFA conference in Orlando. And in addition to Dan, everyone that I met had all of these recommendations and all of these kind of great stories about how they got into sci-fi fantasy, how they approach studying the genre, different takes on the origins of the genre, things like this. And Dan, one of the works that you kept mentioning, or that I heard a number of times, was a little book, very little, called The Circus of Dr. Lao by Charles G. Finney. So after the conference, this was one of the books that I added to my TBR. I picked it up quickly, and again, it's fairly short, and so I read it in like a day, and I loved it, but it's so peculiar and it's just so strange, and I think demands a certain level of conversation to kind of untangle some of its stranger elements. And so I reached out to you, and again, thank you so much for coming on here to talk about this work. And before we get to that book in particular, I was wondering if you wouldn't mind just sharing a little about your background, how you came to study sci-fi and fantasy, and then how you landed on specific or focusing more on Finney and Circus of Dr. Lao.
Sure. I'm technically a professor of business writing here in South Florida at a local state college. But when I was about 8, as many kids kind of in the 80s, my parents were going through a divorce and I got shipped to my grandmother's house. And my grandmother's house was in the middle of nowhere, Alabama. There was nothing to do. There were no kids around, and I was going to be stuck there for a couple of months. And so I set about kind of exploring the house. And the back porch had been converted into a bedroom for my uncle Jimmy when he was a teenager. And I found his room, and his books and his bookshelves were still there. And what was there, as far as his books, was an entire run of the Ballantine adult fantasy series. So when I was 8 and had nothing to do, I spent 2 months and read through the entirety of the Ballantine adult fantasy books, and probably only picked up a third, right, of what I read, because many of those books would have been way above my head. Like, no one reads Gorham Gast at 8 years old and makes any sense of it. But it excited in me kind of a love for the literature. And I spent that summer doing it and then kind of fell away from it. And when I was about 11, I was going through a tough time after moving to South Florida, which is where I live now. And my mom went to a Walden Books, of all places. Like, there used to be bookstores in the mall, Walden Books. And she was talking to one of the guys there and said that I had loved fantasy and was there something he could recommend. And he gave her Robert Asprin's Another Fine Myth from the Myth series, which is great at that age, and kind of reignited my love for it, and then spent all of my time kind of reading through the canon, if you will, as it stood at the time, and what was new of fantasy and SF work. I grew up, a child of, the way I explain it is I have seen every single Star Wars film in the theater on opening weekend, including the first. I don't remember it because I was an infant, but my mother took me even to see A New Hope in theaters. So I kind of grew up in that environment and was always, holding something SF or fantasy based. And I didn't take kind of a traditional path to my education. I fell into being a nightclub DJ when I was about 19, not on purpose, not because it was something I wanted to do. It's just kind of the way it worked. And 10 years later, I was still doing it. But I was in a club one night, and the guy came up to make a request, and I'm reading Raymond Feist's Magician in my left hand and DJing with my right. And the guy's like, "What are you doing?" I'm like, "This is called reading," because I can be kind of a jerk when you're a DJ. And the guy's like, "No, but I mean, why?" And I'm like, "Oh, I'm working on a PhD in literature." And the guy's like, "Oh, okay." And I just decided that maybe if that was the first thing that sprung to mind, maybe I should do a PhD in literature. It's kind of like, it's not a traditional path, but it's the way I did it. So I had the joy of going to Florida Atlantic University, which is one of a very, very small number of schools that had an actual track in the master's program for SF and fantasy lit. But I went for my bachelor's, and my first semester I was really intimidated because I did my first 2 years at the time was called a community college. Because I wasn't going to school until I was 29, I wasn't going to apply to the schools and go live in the dorms. And one of the 2 classes I took was science fiction with Dr. Tom Martin. And that science fiction class, that section, there are 4 of us from that section who I know who all hold PhDs in SF and fantasy. And 3 of us at least are in academia, kind of teaching it or teaching adjacent to it. So it was just one of those magical sections, and realized that, not only did I love this stuff, but that I had some stuff to say about it. And so I did the bachelor's, took a year off with a very long, complicated story that I won't explain here. It is the most heartbreaking graduate school admission story anyone could ever tell you. But ended up at FAU the next year, and thank goodness I did. It's where I met my wife. But for the master's degree, decided to do it in SF and fantasy. And my second semester, Tom Martin was teaching a fantasy graduate level course in the spring, and respected me so much that he actually asked me if there were books I wanted to have him include, which is a lot when you're a second semester master's student. And I can't lay claim to recommending Finney at the time. I'd never heard of it, but I recommended a couple of books, both of which made it on the syllabus. And one of the ones that he put on there was The Circus of Dr. Lau by Finney. And whether it was because what was going on in kind of that semester in my life or what, I absolutely fell in love with this little book. It's, as I say, I've written about it quite a few times, but it's reprintable in as few as 90 pages. And as long, I think my longest version is probably the limited edition book club version. And it's only 135.
Okay.
So it's just one of those things where what I found in it was a puzzle, right? As you said, it's a peculiar little book. It is a novel and not a novel. I've discussed it as many times as it's basically a series of vignettes. There's almost no overarching story, but I've been able to make sense of that. And the more I think about it and the more I dig into it, the more I find in that little book. And I think that's why it sticks with me.
Okay. Well, thank you. I guess I'll comment a little bit about the specific version that I read, because I'm not sure how the different editions really vary. But I just did a little bit of research, and I found that I would guess the original, did it have illustrations in it? Or
it did actually. So this is a signed first.
Okay.
Of Finney. It is missing the just to get you the signature there.
Oh, okay. Oh, cool.
So it is missing the cover, but as you can see, these are, I always pronounce his name wrong, so I'm just going to call him Boris A.
Okay.
But it's Artabashev, I believe, something to that effect is his name. I'll put it on screen for you there.
Oh, okay. Okay.
He's the illustrator, very famous illustrator in fantasy. So the first edition does come with illustrations. The one that a lot of people read without illustrations is the one that Bradbury reprinted. He has a anthology, if you will, of short stories that's called The Circus of Dr. Lau and Other Stories.
Okay.
And that version of Lau has no illustrations, as far as I know. So limited edition book club here, first edition over here. This is the one I actually read for my master's degree and used for the thesis, which is why it's got 800 notes in it. And they all come illustrated. The limited edition book club has its own illustrations.
Okay.
And then there's a British edition by Grey Wolf Press, which is also from the 30s. I want to say 37, 38. That one has very different illustrations, and they're much, much darker than any of the others. Like the Boris illustrations and the limited edition book club, which let me make sure to say who it is who illustrated that. I don't want it to seem as though I'm not interested in mentioning her name. Claire Van Vliet, VLIET, this is limited edition book club of New York. And there are every page is illustrated, in relief etchings in this one. It's if it worked for my first edition signed one, this would be my prize copy of Finney. And then of course there is a horrid movie version.
Okay, is that like the 6 face or 7 faces of Dr. Lau? Okay.
Yeah.
Haven't seen it, but I guess I shouldn't. Okay.
Here's what I'll say is it has almost no connection to the book at all.
Oh, okay.
Almost none. It is I always get it wrong. I think it's Tony Randall who's in that movie. He's the star and he plays Lau. And he also plays all of the magical creatures. There's a romantic love story that runs through the plot. Like they found the plot. There are all kinds of reasons to, like, I had to watch it, but there are all kinds of reasons why I wish I could purge it from my memory.
I'm trying to even think who the romance would be between the satyr and the
satyr and Agnes.
Right. I don't know.
It's a thing. Like it was 2 hours that I felt like was very much I don't want to call it a waste of my life because it sounds very nasty, but I think it would be a cute movie if you'd never read the book.
Okay.
Right. And I'm not normally one of those people who's like, must read the book. But in this case, like, please read the book. It'll take you less time to read the book than it will to watch the movie anyway.
Okay. All right. I guess also maybe before we, go too far and talk about certain specific elements of the book, I'll maybe give a brief description of what I thought it was about, and then if you'd like to, I'm sure you have a much broader or much not broader, but a much more detailed and thorough understanding of the story compared to one-time reader. But so basically, broad strokes, Circus comes into a town in New Mexico, Arizona, and there's a parade that goes through the town of everything that they'll be able to see. Yeah, a parade. Everything that this small town and this small community will be able to see in the circus, and no one in the town can really agree on any of the bizarre things that they see. Like it's this one creature, a bear, or is it a Russian man? And that's a very strange debate.
Yeah. A man, bear, or Russian.
Right. And then so that's the parade, and then you kind of go, everyone's thinking, oh, should we go to the circus? And they eventually decide to in some way, shape, or form. And it sort of takes you through the different events of the different acts, I guess, that are going on at the circus. And there's all of these sort of mythical creatures, and every version of the story is told in a slightly different way. For example, there's one encounter that is just dialogue and just a back and forth. And it's very strange. It's just these townsfolk experiencing a peculiar circus that came to town seemingly out of nowhere, and then at the end they leave. And that's basically it from what I got. Yeah.
Yeah, like I think broad strokes she nailed it, right? So there's a small town called Abalone, Arizona, where nothing really happens and no one ever leaves. And if you ever spent time in a small town, you know exactly what that feels like. There's nothing to do, nothing to see. It's the same, for them, I would imagine the same desert it's always been, so to speak. So this circus shows up out of nowhere. As Alex points out, there is a parade, as I did the scare quotes through town, of 3 beast-drawn drowsy wagons, as Finney writes it. And these 3 wagons hold the entirety of the circus, right? So no one's getting their hopes up really high. But there is some funky stuff with how people perceive that parade, what they see in it. In particular, for one person who I'm sure we'll discuss in a bit, they hear things, like they almost hear the thoughts of people, of beings in the parade, and no one else hears it. And then the parade sets up, or the circus sets up, people come to the circus. There's a carnival barker kind of getting people in. The carnival barker is exceptionally important to the story. And when we get there, you go through a bunch of the little events or the little acts, right? We might think of this, we think of a circus very differently in the late 20th and early 21st century. But at this time, a traveling circus would have had separate tents with each kind of attraction. And this is almost more like what we used to call a circus, like a sideshow, right? Where you'd have the bearded lady and the fishman and all of these kind of strange, the negative term for it, which I think we've moved on from, but they used to call them freak shows at the time. That's how they were advertised. And then everyone goes to, or most everyone from town goes to the main event, which is in the big tent, which involves the city of Woldercan. And then as it seems to hit a climax, the tent collapses and the circus vanishes, and people, most of them, just go back to their lives. It is, as Alex said, a very peculiar little book.
And then kind of even after that, and again, I'm not sure if this is in all of the editions, but there's the character list at the end, and that is just hilarious. And that is, I guess, Finney pointing out how strange the story that he's just told is, in a way.
In some ways, I think it's also kind of an homage to modernism, right? Okay. And modernist ideas. So it's a catalog at the end of the book. Like, not only is it the characters, he says the male characters, the female characters, the mythical creatures, the food, like every food and vegetable mentioned. And then my favorite part is he lists the unanswered questions from the book.
Right.
So like all those times where you get through a series, you're like, they never answered this. And Finney instead just writes all these questions like, hey, this is the stuff I didn't bother to answer for you. And it's hysterical because it's what he's kind of pointing out. The other thing that's neat about that, of course, is that the catalog is not true. There's a ton of stuff in the catalog that is not in the book at all. And so the reasons why he lists it, like I've kind of guessed at a few times, but some of it may be that it was things that were edited out, but other things are just like, what do you mean there's an eggplant? Like there's no eggplant in this book. or whatever it is. Like I can't remember the specific vegetable, but I have it marked in one of my editions of like, no, you're a liar. Um, but he goes through and lists everything, and the descriptions from that catalog, you often do get more about the characters, if you will. Particularly if you're kind of reading this, as I read the first time, kind of casually,
Yeah.
right? If you're reading this, from an academic standpoint, then you're going to dig into it very differently. But if you're reading it casually, you're like, okay, so this is a school teacher, whatever. And then you get to the end and you read what he has to say about Agnes Birdsong, who's the school teacher. Um, what's fascinating to me about Finney's book, perhaps the most fascinating thing, is that, like many books, people pick it up and they love it or they hate it, right? So some people read it, particularly the reviewers when it first came out, and see absolutely no value in this book at all. And then you have people like me who can't let go of it. And I kind of thought I was the only one. And one year at ICFA, Neil Gaiman was our guest of honor. And I was on a round table about teaching Neil Gaiman, so things that you kind of cover from Gaiman. And in one of his short stories, I made the argument that what he does is he takes Agnes Birdsong from Finney's text and brings her into the late 20th century, developing and kind of growing her character. She rides in through smoke, straddling two tigers in like dominatrix gear. And I didn't know at the time that I'd be making this argument to Neil Gaiman, who's seated like 10 feet away. And I'm a master's student. I have no business making this. But Gaiman is wonderful in person if you haven't met him. He's so kind. But he stood up at the end as like he was a respondent to what we all said. And when he stood up, he looked at me, he said, Dan, he's like, I never realized it. But yeah, I think you're right. He's like, and I don't have any tattoos, but if I did, it would say, was it a man, bear, or Russian? And at that moment, like the Grinch, my heart grew 3 sizes, because I'm like, here is this guy who wrote stories that I'm the perfect age for. The Sandman comics came out when I was in high school, as a little kind of like emo goth kid. And so I was a total fanboy, and to have him say that was like, oh, he also loves this book. Right. And it was this absolutely fantastic moment. So I think that, as I always tell people when I recommend it, it's an hour and a half of your life to sit down and read it, maybe 2 hours, maybe less. Lots of people read faster than me. And it'll either stick with you forever or it'll be a throwaway. And if it is a throwaway, but you're kind of intrigued about it, then, I'll tell you that Finney was so upset with the reviews of this book, and he doesn't say this anywhere. There's no biography of Charles G. Finney. There's certainly no autobiography. All of his papers and his letters are at University of Arizona. I've dug through them enough to tell you that I didn't find anything where he actually responds to these, but every review, and by every I mean 4, the 4 reviews of the Circus of Dr. Lau refer to it as licentious, funny, hysterical romp, borderline pornographic. I know I'm really selling this book here. And you got to remember it's the 30s. Mm-hmm. But it seemed like all any one of the reviewers got out of it was the humor. And so the next book that Finney puts out is The Unholy City by Charles Finney. This is a really interesting cover art version. There are no illustrations to The Unholy City. So it has a slightly more typical plot, though it is just as odd and weird as the Circus of Dr. Lau is. What it is, though, is it is not funny at all. Okay. And he's taken the vocabulary from, I would say Circus of Dr. Lau could pretty easily be read by, like, as far as reading level, someone 11, 12, 13 could easily get through it. There are no large words in there. The Unholy City is like, no, I'm writing this for what we would now consider grad school and what at the time would have been a bachelor's degree level. Um, there are a ton of SAT words, if you will, in the Unholy City. And I think he does it in a sense to kind of say like, hey, y'all missed the point. And so I'm going to write this thing. And it turns out that that's not what people wanted. So that book comes out like 3 years after Lao. And then nothing comes out again until almost the 60s when he puts out Magician Out of Manchuria. These are both British editions. And this is very different. This is much more about it's what they call the Circus of Dr. Lao so often is it's chinoiserie, right? So it's kind of a white American male version of what Asian culture is, which is definitely not advised as a thing to do. Finney does have at least some firsthand experience with that. One of the books I have over here is The Old China Hands. So Finney is in the military between World War One and World War II, and he's stationed in Tientsin, China, which is close to where he argues Lao is from, and where they say they catch some of the mythical creatures. And, you know, I assume that a lot of that has to do with early 20th century and lack of knowledge of the Asian continent, right? So he's there, but he knows most of his readers have never been to Asia and never will be. So he can make up almost anything. He may as well say he got them on Pluto. It doesn't really matter.
Right. Maybe backing up a little bit to something you mentioned, would you ever consider writing a biography about, or have you written anything sort of biographical about Finney?
So I haven't written anything really biographical about Finney. He does have ancestors who survive to this day. And before I even considered it, I'd want to reach out to them and see if they even wanted it done.
Sure.
The closest thing to a biographical sketch you get are kind of like basics of, you know, his personality. I know that, and it's not a stretch once you read Circus of Dr. Lao, but he had no real love for at least the beliefs of his great-great-grandfather, who's the revivalist preacher, Charles Finney. So oftentimes when you go to look up Finney, what you find is actually stuff on this revivalist preacher who's going around erecting tents and bringing people to his faith, if you will. And this Finney, as you can tell from the text, has absolutely no love for that kind of behavior, at least as near as I can tell. What I really want to do, and I just have to find someone who's willing to do it. So the Circus of Dr. Lao falls in and out of print. It's fallen out of print a few times, even in the last 20 years. And I'm sure, unless you got yours as used as I did, your version probably doesn't look like this. No. It'll have a different illustration on it if you bought it recently, because this one went out of print. This one was printed on under the Bison book mark, and another publisher will pick it up, run it for a few years, and it falls out. But what I would really, really like to do is do an annotated edition of the Circus of Dr. Lao. I have files on this computer from doing the dissertation. I probably have 250 pages of just footnotes of what he's referencing, and where he's kind of coming from. I'd love to do something biographical on Finney. I'd love to do the annotated version. Part of what I'm trying to work on now is just a monograph about this book. So my master's thesis is 83 pages just on the Circus of Dr. Lao. My doctoral dissertation has an entire chapter devoted to the Circus of Dr. Lao. And people who have had the pleasure or displeasure, depending on who they are, of hearing me talk at ICFA and give a paper almost always hear Finney referenced. it's the one book that in almost everything I do academically that continues to come up. So the answer to your question is I'd love to, but I've got to get there first, and I would really want to talk to the family and just make sure. Like, I'd also, it's very hard because Finney dies. Finney's been dead, I want to say, since the 70s or 80s. And so, excuse me, I would want to find some people who actually knew him. Like, I can tell you he was actually a newspaper editor in his real life. I have The Old China Hands. I may as well show that one. I've shown all the others. The Old China Hands is a memoir of his. So it's got a nice picture of Finney in uniform on the back.
Oh, okay.
So he writes that while he's in China. He's in the unit nickname is the CB, and Can Do is their logo, which is why it's on the front. But so he writes that and gives you a little bit of background, but it's written very early in his life. It's predominantly about his experience of his unit in China. And the city in which he was in was divided into 4 quadrants. So you had like an American, an English, maybe a French. I don't remember if it was French or somewhere else. But each corner of the city had some imperial power over it. And kind of the clash of all of these cultures and problems. And then at one point, like, they're going to be actually attacked by Chinese nationalists, of course, who are trying to take parts of their country back, understandably. And it's mostly about that. There's something in there, or a few things in there, if you're a fan of Dr. Lau, and it's worth reading. But The Old China Hands has been out of print long enough ago that mine comes from the Miami Public Library. And it was only because when I was done with it, they're like, well, it's $132 if you don't want to return it. And so I wrote them a check.
Nice. Okay.
Because like, they're like, no one's checked it out in 10 years. So if you want to keep it, it's 130 something. Well, okay, here you go. Here's a check.
Okay.
That was a third of what I made a week as a grad student, but it's still worth it.
Worth it, yeah.
So, but yeah, I'd absolutely love to write a bio at some point.
Are there any characters or particular storylines that I guess first I'll ask, are there any that jumped out to you as the most intriguing your first time reading, but maybe that's changed? Maybe you love a character now that you've actually poured more attention into them?
Yeah, I mean, I think I love them all in their own way. Well, most. They're the two college students.
Yeah, the frat boys.
I have no love for the frat boys. I know that's a big shock coming from a guy who grew up reading SF and fantasy. But like, initially what intrigued me so much was probably Agnes Birdsong. She's the high school English teacher. She's the first vignette in the book. She is seduced by a satyr, and she comes looking for that seduction. It's very clear from Finney's text that she's coming looking for that, and he doesn't judge her for it. And I think that's part of what made me fall in love with Finney very early in this text, right? Is, in 1936, a woman who was seeking kind of sexual satisfaction would have been depicted in a very particular way in most texts. She certainly would have been judged negatively, and Finney doesn't do that to her. And I think that's part of what kind of stuck with me about the book very early. But the character that I come back to again and again is Apollonius of Tyana.
Okay.
Apollonius of Tyana is arguably, and I'll talk about this a little bit if you want, but he's arguably the reason this book gets written. So Apollonius of Tyana is a real figure in culture, if you will, who lives and is depicted around the time that Christianity depicts the life of Jesus. And Apollonius of Tyana is, like, for some people, I don't want to sound heretical to some of your audience or not, but some people see him as the actual kind of Christ figure that Jesus is modeled off of, people who believe that way. Other people see him as just someone who was a random mystic, kind of doing the same, with many of the same ideas. But Apollonius of Tyana is someone we can actually trace to a period and a time outside of religious texts. And the reason why I say he's the cause of it is, for as odd a book as the Circus of Dr. Lau is, and I swear I'll back up to characters here in a second.
You're good.
For as odd a book as the Circus of Dr. Lau is, it's actually modeled off another text.
Okay.
Like, and this is not something that anyone necessarily knows, but if you went to high school and you were in some kind of advanced English course and they made you read Flaubert, they made you read Madame Bovary by Gustave Flaubert. It's considered the essence of modernism, right? Or of kind of realist modernism. Flaubert is, depicting humanity exactly. And that's what he's known for. But the book Flaubert went back to and revised 20 or 30 times in his life is actually a fantasy book.
Okay.
He called it fantasy. And it's The Temptation of Saint Anthony. This is a version that Finney would have actually read as far as time period.
Okay.
This is a more modern version. This one, of course, is Modern Library edition. So this one is still absolutely printable, Modern Library Classic. So The Temptation of Saint Anthony is about Saint Anthony, of course, but it's Apollonius who appears throughout the book. But here's what's interesting. Apollonius, a chimera, like, I could keep going, but half of what is in Finney's Circus is in this Flaubert text. This particular version, and this is a first edition of this particular translation. This is translated by Lafcadio Hearn. This is from 1910. And the reason why it's important to kind of say that it's that text is, of course, the text was revised, but it's also because the specific translation impacts things that Finney does in the text. So Finney had clearly read this because the reason why the old China hands comes up all the time is because Finney starts writing the Circus of Dr. Lau while he's in China. Like, he doesn't start it when he gets home, he starts it in China, but of course, he wouldn't have been able to bring a ton of stuff with him. But what he could bring with him is his memory of what he's read. He clearly had read The Temptation of Saint Anthony. And part of what I've done in some of those notes is made all these connections and shown this. And I was kind of spitballing this and talking to my wife's also a PhD in science fiction, particularly. And she had to listen to me the whole time I'm working on this dissertation. I'm doing all this stuff with him. I'm like, no, you don't understand. I figured out where he got it from. Like, this unlocks the whole book. And she's like, yeah, but you're making this argument and you have no real proof. And that's when I started digging into his papers from University of Arizona. There's an unpublished story Finney wrote called The Temptation of Dr. Lau. And it's one of the last things he wrote, and he never printed it. It's so the version I have is it's a photocopied version with his handwritten notes in it and everything that the amazing librarians at the University of Arizona were kind enough to photocopy and send to me an email or scan and send to me. And when I found The Temptation of Dr. Lau, I'm like, that's it, right? Like, that's my closing argument. I found the evidence I needed. And so it's fantastic to me because, of course, since I was a fantasy and SF kid, I had no interest in Madame Bovary by Flaubert in high school. I was like, you don't understand the genius of Flaubert. I'm like, no, I understand the genius. I just don't like the book, right? It's not my bag, right? But I can appreciate it even if I don't love it. And then when I figured out that he's taking it from Temptation Island, I went through and read this, and I'm like, if they'd made me read this by Flaubert, I would have been a huge Flaubert fan growing up. Because Flaubert, who does have many biographies and has a ton of stuff written about him, is quoted often as saying that it's the fantasy book that he always comes back to. The Tentation, Temptation of Saint Anthony, of course, originally in French, is that book that he's talking about. And so, in some ways, we have this like French realism to thank for whatever we want to call Finney. I've always called it fantasy. I think there's no doubt in that, but it doesn't fit into a model. Like, it's not urban fantasy. It's not it's like, I could argue that it's kind of portal fantasy. It's not secondary world. Like, nobody knows really what to call it. And I think that that's kind of the beauty of the book, right? Is it doesn't fit well into a shoebox. And it's odd. It's a book that's a favorite of other authors. Beagle is certainly using it in The Last Unicorn with Mommy Fortuna's Circus, which I could talk about a little bit. Bradbury uses it for Something Wicked This Way Comes, which is why he prints an anthology with it. Gaiman clearly had read it, and I'm like, okay, well, am I in decent company? Well, Bradbury, Beagle, and Gaiman all love this little book. So yeah, they're all infinitely more brilliant than I'll ever be. And yes, I consider myself in good company. So just like the short version, if anyone in the audience or you is familiar with The Last Unicorn by Peter Beagle, then you'll be familiar with Mommy Fortuna's Circus. What you may not be familiar with is an article by David Miller, who was a professor at Purdue, and was a professor of my professor, Tom Martin, who I mentioned earlier. Okay. Which is probably why I ended up reading this in grad school. But David Miller writes an academic article about Mommy Fortuna's ontological circus, which is a really, really fancy way to break this down into thumbnail version, that the mythical creatures in Mommy Fortuna's Circus are not what they appear to be. So they've had glamour spells cast upon them to make them appear to be fantastic creatures, right? The neat thing about that, of course, is that Finney, and this is the master's thesis in a sentence, Finney's circus is epistemological. So Finney's circus and the beings in Finney's circus are actually mythical creatures. There's nothing false about them. The sea serpent is a sea serpent. The chimera is a chimera. The hound of the hedges, which is sui generis, is the hound of the hedges. And that it's only because of that it's possible for Beagle to have a circus where things aren't what they appear. Because if there were no real fantasy creatures, then there's no way to glamour something into a real looking creature, because there is no real. And those real creatures are the creatures that exist in Lau's circus. For Bradbury's part, I would say, I could probably dig into it more, but really it's just the idea of kind of this traveling circus carnival, that the moment you step onto the property, you almost enter this, almost go through this portal, right? Enter kind of a realm of fae, or enter like almost a secondary world, or even just a glamour of your primary. Excuse me. Where things are fantastic, things become not just possible, but probable within it. And, that's kind of, that may be the extent of it. But I think that, some of these characters and what they go through are stock enough that they get picked up. And whether we see them as picked up because, and now I'm verging into my dissertation, but because of what we read, or we just see them picked up because they're the types of people we meet all the time, right? They're prototypes. Yeah. I don't like stereotypes in that sense, because stereotypes is a very negative connotation. And what I'm trying to say is that, if I say to you that someone is a proofreader, then you have a very specific connotative idea of what that person is like.
Yeah.
Right. Like a proofreader is probably not, at the football game, if there is one, and they're probably not out working out, and they definitely probably wear glasses. Right. And, all these other things, we have these ideas of who these people are. And because of that, they show up. I will say, though he's not my favorite character, Mr. Edwin, that's how I pronounce his name because there's no one to correct me. In the Circus of Dr. Lau is arguably one of the most important characters. He's the closest we get. Like Finney splits himself into a couple of people. Larry Kemper, who's the military vet, is clearly part analog of Finney. Mr. Edwin, who's the proofreader, known as a checker of errors in the catalog, is clearly part of Finney because that was his job. And there are a few other, like there are little tidbits. The reason I'm going to circle all the way back to why I like Apollonius so much, but the reason why I love Apollonius so much is because so Apollonius is the carnival barker at the beginning who gets everyone to kind of come in. He's the fortune teller and the magician within the circus kind of sideshows. And of course, he's almost the ringleader or barker in the main event. What I love for Apollonius, though, is I love the two scenes of him as both the magician and as the fortune teller, because he tells the woman, I'm going to tell you your actual fortune. Are you sure you want to know? And like so many people, she's like many of the readers, right? She's like, yeah, I want to know my fortune because of course you think your futures are going to be wonderful, right? Am I going to find oil on my land and strike it rich? No, you will die penniless. Like nobody wants to hear that.
Right.
It's very odd. I would imagine that you go to a psychic these days and they're like, oh, you're going to die penniless and unhappy. Please come back next week. Like no one's returning for that. But he tells her the truth, and the truth is painful for her. And she leaves unsatisfied and decides, well, he just doesn't know what he's talking about. And then, of course, when he's the magician, he's conjuring, right? And he conjures these amazing things. Like he brings a guy back from the dead who's got something written in his hatband. There's I can't remember if that guy is the werewolf or there's another that's a werewolf. He conjures a two-headed turtle who we learn in the catalog dies because it splits itself in half. Yeah. It can never decide which way to go. And of course, that's very much an analog to the two kids who asked for the turtle, right? So you've got these two children and they're going to diverge in different paths. And because of that, you split what is often seen as like a singular creature. And that's what I mean about this little book. I want to say it haunts me because it's negative, but I come back to it all the time and I find it in my life all the time, which is astounding, as I said, considering you can reproduce it in 90 pages. And it is arguably one of the earliest American fantasy texts, at least within kind of what I would call the Anglo canon. There are certainly a ton of native texts that fall into that and First Nation texts, but as far as written kind of for an English speaking audience, like it's very, very early and very anathema to what's going on, right? Like this is the era of sword and sorcery. Like this is what they want for fantasy. And he's like, here's the Circus of Dr. Lau. And you're like, how did you even get this printed? Right. Like, I don't know who decided to print that first edition. And I'm grateful they did. But I have no idea what they were thinking. Like none. I have no idea why anyone would have printed this book at the time. So, I mean, I think for me, all those characters that exist are interesting, but it's Agnes who kind of got me into it. And it's Apollonius that keeps me coming back. And beyond that, and Apollonius, of course, in the catalog is only noted as a legend. That's his entire description, I believe. He may say something else about him, but they do. No, Apollonius of Tyana, a legend. That's his entire catalog entry. Just like Mr. Edwin, the proofreader, is written as a catalog or corrector of errors, right? And so the old like party in golf pants, a bore. Not BOAR, but BORE, like boring. And like they're, again, like he mentions Kubla Khan, but where's Kubla Khan in the book?
Right.
He's not there. But he's in the catalog. And so like he might be in the book, but I can't remember. He might be during the scene where they're trapping either the Chimera or the Hound of the Hedges. But the idea here is you've taken this giant character in the book and just missed him into one word: legend. And then, this is what I mean about this book as a puzzle, which is, I will tell you flat out that as a kid, and even early in my college career, I absolutely despised modernism. I just couldn't get into it, particularly modernist poetry. It wasn't something I liked at all. I couldn't find something to grab me. Again, I could appreciate it, but I couldn't love it. And I couldn't even fully appreciate it until I took a class with one of my mentors, Dr. Mark Scroggins. And Dr. Scroggins, who is a poet, an amazing poet in his own right, but he's teaching this modernist poetry class, and he starts to explain that you have to unlock it like a puzzle. And it was, I would say it was a light bulb that went off, but it may as well have been, a mushroom cloud in my head. All of a sudden, modernist poetry and modernist ideas really opened up to me when I understood they were a puzzle. And so by the time I came back to get through and figure out how I was going to fit Finney in the dissertation, because I knew I wanted him there, that was when I really realized that no, Finney's written a puzzle, right? Like Finney's written me a book that says, go find other books. So when he says Apollonius of Tyana is a legend, you're like, well, I got to Google that, right? I got to search for that, using using the search engine of your choice, but it's going to be Google. And that'll probably lead you to like a wiki page. And what you'll find is you'll find Temptation of St. Anthony, but you'll also find that there was like this, and it still exists. But there's this small society of people who see Apollonius as like the true savior, right? Like Christian savior kind of way. They still have there's still a society in New York that still has space in a building in Manhattan that incidentally was once run by the woman who paid to have this printed. This Temptation of St. Anthony from 1910. So she's part of how it is, and she of course ends up in her own way. She's kind of in Circus of Dr. Lau. But and this is why I say, like, if you've been listening to me, because I feel like I've been rambling for like 25 minutes.
No, you've been great. Yeah.
Without letting you talk. But this is what I mean about, here I am talking about 25 minutes. I've been talking about this book and I haven't told you anything about this book yet, right? Like, this is what fascinates me about it is, I devoted 30 pages to talking about just the parade, which is like 8 pages of the text. I devoted 5 pages to talking about the ad that runs in the newspaper, like, because you can tear it down so much in what is and isn't there. And that's what the Circus of Dr. Lau does, like, to me. That was a really long answer for what my favorite vignettes were, but hopefully you'll find some value in that. But it's how Agnes is depicted, and Apollonius of Tyana, who is very clearly, I think you could tell from my answer now, my favorite character. But there are all kinds of other things. You know, the Chimera is brilliant in their own way. The sea serpent is fascinating because the sea serpent speaks to Mr. Edwin, and they have this like philosophical discussion
Right.
about the nature of life and cultures around the world. And like the sea serpent's like, I watched this little boy and I was intrigued, and then I ate him.
Uh-huh.
Like, and it's very kind of, it's very startling when you're reading the text and very kind of off-putting, and then you kind of go back to, you know, maybe this goes back to like that parable, right? Like you knew I was a snake, you know,
Right.
like,
Why'd you
why
tell
did you
me?
bite me? You knew I was a snake.
Right.
um and that's kind of the sea serpent, you know. And then you get through the book and you think about all these beings that you were just introduced to, including, like, it tells you in the text, the main tent, he rebuilt the entire city of Woldercan, which doesn't exist. There's no ever been a city of Woldercan. But the whole city, and you're like, okay, but this came in on 3 wagons. Like,
Uh-huh.
one of them, of course, is actually being pulled. It's actually being pulled by Apuleius's golden axe. Like, I don't know, like, how many people necessarily catch that, but, and I apologize to the algorithm. I'm using that as a synonym for donkey, but that is
Yeah.
the title of the book. Um, that, you know, it's Apuleius's fantastic text from, you know, the BC era. It's the golden, we'll call it donkey this time, donkey pulling that wagon. You're like, okay, but a donkey's pulling an entire city, right?
Right.
And a chimera and a sea serpent that can encircle the earth, and, you know, like, it's pure impossibility, right? So then you have to go back and say, so is the parade actually happening, right? Like, how are these, like, what are the logistics of this? And I'm not a person who likes to dig into the logistics of my fantasy too much. Um, I know there are a lot of people who get really caught up in, like, you don't understand, this magic system doesn't make sense. I'm not one of those people. I love those people. I have no problem with them. Like, I feel like everyone can see what they want in these texts. It's just not my style. But to a certain extent, like, okay, it has to at least follow the rules of its own text, right? Which is the other neat thing about Lao. So the Circus of Dr. Lao tells you when it violates those rules,
Uh-huh.
right? Like, one of the unanswered questions in the back has to do with the chimera. And it says, like, inasmuch as legend tells us that chimera were invariably female, how did it happen that Dr. Lao's was a male?
Uh-huh.
And it doesn't tell you. It just
Right.
asks you the question, right? But it's that kind of thing that, you know, is okay. So if Laos is male, it's telling us that legend says chimera are female, which is correct according to my research. Then what's the point, right?
Right.
Like, why has he done it? And, you know, what's cool is that he tells you, like, yeah, I violated this rule. It's almost like he's writing for the audience that comes to the comments, like, you don't understand, chimeras are supposed to be female, you know. And if Finney's like, no, I do understand. I just violated it for fun, right? And because I think we've often, at least I have often had that experience from reading some fantasy text, and because it doesn't agree with the mega text in my head, right? Like, I never mentioned the book, but I was reading a book and someone kills a vampire with a silver bullet. A vampire with a silver bullet. And I threw the book across the room. I'm like, no, that's a werewolf,
Yeah.
you moron, you know? And of course, like, I picked the book back up. It kind of explains it was blessed silver or something, but I'm still like, no, right? Like, you violated this. I have all of this. No, that's not how you kill a vampire. It's how you kill a werewolf. And that's kind of core to my dissertation argument, which is like, why did I have that reaction? It's
Mhm.
not like there are actually vampires or werewolves. There's no way to test this theory. I've
Right.
just decided, I've randomly chosen that this is true because this has been true in 20 books. So how dare you violate it now? And it kind of made me realize that the stuff that happens in a book, right, in a fantasy book, and again, I don't want to talk about this forever. I want to be that guy with a doctorate, but the stuff that happens in a book is as real in my brain and in my memory and in how I approach the world as the stuff that happens in my real life.
Yeah.
And that's the core argument of the dissertation. But but if you take that and you go back to like what's going on in these vignettes in Finney's Lao, a large part of what you find is that, and I don't want to break them down into parables because that doesn't do the book justice, right? But I think for each of us, like there's probably something to be gained from each vignette. And I think what's neat about it is that each time I go through and I read this, there's a different vignette I'm attached to. And I think it's because of where I am in my life. The vignettes don't change. But in a very kind of Roland Barthes way, like my attachment to them, what I find in them changes. And so there have been times when I understood that English teacher who, what she wants in her life is something passionate, right? Her life is a bore. She is required to dress a certain way by society. She is a school teacher. She's very prim and proper as depicted early in the text based on the fact that she arrives at 2:36 p.m. Not 2:30, not 2:30-ish, 2:36. Like it is very, very, I think it's 2:36 anyway, but it's a very particular time. And that she did it on purpose, and she keeps repeating this mantra to herself, right? Like, you are a calm, rational woman.
Right.
You're a calm, rational. But I certainly understand that, right? There have been times in my life where I wasn't passionate about anything, and I'm looking for any way to kind of re-spark that in my life. And so for those moments, Agnes attaches to me. And then at others, it's like, oh man, I wonder what my future will be. And then you get to like the 14th hour, excuse me. And you're like, wow, I really hope that's not what my future will be. And then there are other times as I get older. I probably first read this book when I was in my early 30s. Oh. And so my early 30s had hit one way. I'm now in my late 40s, kind of approaching 50. And the more I read it now, the more I understand Edwin's discussion with the sea serpent, right? Trying to kind of grasp from this creature that can span the whole earth and has seen everything and lived for thousands of years, like, what can you tell me about life? What secret can you unlock for me as we kind of hit my age and a little older, we really start to engage our mortality and the idea that we will never, like, I will never finish my TBR pile. Yeah. Right. And like, I will die with books unread that I want, and not just because of the size, like just because I keep adding to it as I read something. And so there will be some book that I never get to know the end of. There are going to be all these stories that I'll never know. And Edwin is very much kind of trying to seek some kind of knowledge and truth in the existence of the sea serpent. And, perhaps it's as simple as what the serpent says, like, the kid was juicy, so I ate him. Right. Like that for Finney, at least in that scene and in that moment, that is the truth of existence. Right? That existence just is. And, Apollonius doesn't get us any more of it. I mean, even so much as to, it doesn't really spoil anything, but a non-Christian version of Satan shows up in the City of Oldercan episode. He's engaged as Satron Metrikig, which I had to ask. Thankfully, I know some brilliant people who are so much smarter than me. But it's that kind of like surname given to him is actually a description that marks him as enemy. So Satan as enemy, and that word is Hebrew. And this is a like a Hebrew, like this is a Hebrew way of engaging that idea. This was a rabbi who's a friend of mine, who's also a specialist in ancient languages, um, who had been kind enough to answer this question because I Googled forever and couldn't find anything. Um, so this very non-Christian kind of version of Satan appears, and Apollonius is the one who banishes him, right? And like, how are we supposed to read into that? Like for Finney, who's again the great grandson or great great grandson of a revivalist preacher, and it's not calling upon like the power of a Christian God or Savior. It's Apollonius is like, get out of here. And he's just gone. Bye. He's banished. But Apollonius can't do anything to the great god Yodel, who is the deity worshipped in the city of Oldercan, the Big Ten. And it's one of those things, man. As I kind of told you when I met you, and I tell everyone who listens, I can talk about this book forever. And it worries me sometimes. They're like, oh, don't talk to Dan, he's gonna bring up Lao. But there's so much in every one of these, and there are I think I went through and numbered them at one point, but it was early in my career, but I think there are 12 different vignettes that you can kind of mark. I would be remiss if I didn't at least point out that there are two that are problematic at different levels within the book.
Yeah.
There is one that is certainly would certainly be considered racist now, and I would argue was racist even in the 30s. With it that engages an African god and a young white woman, and is very much kind of indicative of a jazz age depiction of the fears of white men losing white women to men of color. The other, which I've argued back and forth a couple of different times, is the Peep Show that the two frat boys are dying to see, but they're not allowed to see because they're drunk.
They're not respecting the circus. Yeah.
Right. Well, and the circus says like you can't be inebriated to see the show, and they pound a couple of beers because they're frat boys, and they're gonna go see the Peep Show. And the idea of a Peep Show and that kind of like objectification of the female form, again, no matter how it was perceived in 1936, like I just kind of want to put it out there in the event that if someone sees this, like, man, that book sounds like so much fun, I want to read it. I want to make sure I've at least prepared, like, look, these two things are not like, you can skip them if you want. And there's still so much to take out of the text. And, so I wanted to at least mention them to your viewers. So that no one was in the comment section like, I went and got that book and I read this horrible racist thing, like I want people to feel like I misled them.
Right.
And just in case someone thinks I'm not sponsored by Finney,
right.
or any book publisher, I just really, really love the book. I'm trying to think of other people I've been attached to. Like, I've been attached to Larry at times. As I was telling Alex when we were talking at one point, I spent the first years of my life in a very small town in rural Alabama, which is kind of how I ended up at my grandmother's house in more rural Alabama. And Larry Camper, who joins the military because it's the only way to get the hell out of town, right? Like, there's so many of my friends who I grew up with up until fourth grade. Like, the entirety of my fourth grade class was 25 students. That's everyone in fourth grade in my town. It's that small. And of those 25, the last time I looked was probably 10 years ago, 21 of them still lived in that same town.
Oh my goodness. Oh wow.
Like, most of them have never been further than Atlanta, which is a 3.5-hour drive. Some of them have been to Disney World, which is a 9-hour drive, right? But they've never left the Southeast. They're stuck in this kind of very isolationist, bubble, right? Like, the world doesn't come to Alabaster, Alabama, if you will, and Alabaster, Alabama doesn't often enter the world. And maybe that's changed. People from Alabaster, Alabama, I left in 1985 and I ain't been back, if you will. But, you know, Larry joins the military to get out. And I have plenty of friends who grew up in other small towns, not Alabaster, who joined the military just to get out, right? Like this is, you got out of town, you either went to college on some kind of scholarship or you joined the military. And because of the education system that I was growing up in at the time, so many of those people, it was military. And so I understood that about Larry. And then, you know, Larry's also, you know, he's what the Allman Brothers would call a rambler man, right? He's a rambler. He doesn't really want to sit still. He wants to kind of see the country and the world. And my own father was kind of like that. My dad traveled as he worked for an engineering company, but he traveled around the world, and I would get postcards from Germany or from China or from Canada or from England or from Mexico as a kid after my parents divorced. And, you know, then after my dad passed away, I had found a box of his that had all the postcards his dad had sent him, because his dad had been a navigator flying with Pan Am after being a pilot in World War II. And so there are all these postcards from all these places around the world. And I'm like, oh, I come from a long line of guys who can't sit still. That's what this is, you know. And you know, I've got kind of all these things. And again, you know, like to kind of pull it back to what we're talking about, like I can pull that back to Finney and the Rogers family, right? Like, you know, you grow up like this is a family who, man and wife, 2 kids, they clearly don't have a ton of money, and they have enough to see like one side show in the main event, right? So they go see The Magician, they go see Apollonius. And, you know, again, that's something that it resonates with my background. I didn't grow up in a house where I could have gone to all of the shows. I would have had to pick 1 or 2. My mom always made it fun. She made a game out of it. We used to see like who could get the best lunch at Disney World for $5.
Oh, nice. Yeah.
Which now would be like $25.
Right.
But, you know, as I said, I'm approaching 50. So $5 at the time, the secret to my winning that all the time was the Picosville Cafe. I don't think it exists anymore, but that was it. In Adventureland or Frontierland in Disney. But, you know, you pull back to, you know, there's so many of these moments in the text, and, you know, the closest thing to an enlightened kind of scholarly work, there are only 2 scholarly articles written on Lao that aren't by me. And one of them, you know, talks about how like they think Finney is commenting on like the easy credit system and debt in the 30s. And I don't see that in the book at all personally. But what I do see is this commentary on what it's like to be in a small town that is impoverished, right? Like no one in this town is wealthy. No one in this town has a ton of money. The closest you get is Miss, is it Kassan? I think is her name. She's the old woman who wants her fortune told.
Right.
But even she wants to know, like, are they going to find oil on my land? Am I going to marry a rich man? So for as you know, society as she is for Avalone, Arizona, right? Like she's not really moneyed. And I think in part, right, that's almost why he might call the town Abalone, right? Abalone is, of course, we kind of know it as almost like mother of pearl, it's the inside of an oyster shell, right? But it's something that pretends to be something that it's not, right? It's so often used as a substitute for other gemstones. And, you know, so in that way, perhaps that's kind of what he's doing with naming the town Abalone. But Finney did live in Arizona. That's where he was a proofreader. Again, I mentioned earlier to a couple people when I meet them that he's from Missouri, but he goes to China in the military, comes back and lives in Arizona. He never really goes back to Missouri. for whatever reason. I've never been to Missouri, so I refuse to comment on it. But he found himself in Arizona and he liked it. Um, like the thing, I guess kind of the thing I would ask that I find really neat, because I so rarely get to talk to someone who's read it for the first time,
Mhm.
is I would ask you, like, other than the book being kind of weird, right?
Uh-huh. Uh-huh.
Um, what do you think stuck with you? Like, what was it that stuck out to you in that first read that made you think like, wow, I gotta talk to Dan about this Finney book. This is weird.
So I think I I especially wanted to have a conversation when I got to the catalog stuff at the end.
Mhm.
And I think part of it was just, I mean, I'm not a lit studies person. I did my
Yeah.
master's in history, but with all the fantasy and stuff that I've gotten into and epic fantasy, all this stuff, I mean, of course, like you have the character lists and you have the maps and you have the appendices and glossaries and
Mhm.
so many fantasy books to like help with the world building. And so when I got to that
Right.
catalog, I was like, okay, this is not that I didn't think it was fantasy before then, but I thought this is kind of a trademark of the genre. And it's so
Yep.
interesting to see it kind of represented like in this comedic way at the end of the book, or surreal comedic way at the end of
Yeah.
the book. Um, and so yeah, I thought, okay, I definitely need to have a conversation about this. But then I also just started to think more and more about how fantasy it is and how it's all like other fantasy books are parading their creatures throughout their stories, sort of, and
Mhm.
parading all of these different mythical beasts and whatever. And I thought that was interesting, thinking about like, okay, well, are any of these things that these people are going to see in the circus, or any of them any stranger than like a, I don't know, like an Alfred something, or a unicorn
Right.
that I might see in a epic fantasy that I'm like in a secondary world that I'm more used to. So
Mhm.
yeah, those kinds of things, just how I guess in short, the world building of it, I thought was really interesting because it was on such a small scale in the circus. But then, yeah, I mean, even when it was on a big scale with the city of Wildercan, it was inside of a tent, or it was,
Right.
yeah. Um,
Well, and what's kind of neat about that, right, is that that world building is for Loud Circus by Finney, and then you could argue, so the city of Boulder can exist within it, but the other thing Finney's actually building there is your world,
mhm,
right? Is the world being built is your perception of the world in which you live. And it's for those of us, I do read a ton of epic fantasy, and a ton of secondary world fantasy, and that, like, I love this little book, but other than that, I don't read a lot of like fantasy invades the normal space type works. But it's done, as you said, kind of in the end in the catalog, instead of, for example, one of the things I mentioned in a diss I wrote. I know you do a lot of stuff with Erickson's Malice and
yes,
Mark,
yeah.
and I wrote in the diss that Erickson knows that no one's going to be able to follow Gardens of the Moon, and he tells you what's going to happen in the chapter in the epigraph before the chapter.
Mhm.
Like the world, like, yes, the world building's in those epigraphs too, because you're like, oh wait, the first so and so, the elder, the younger, the this, the that. But yeah, if you go back and read it, those like songs or poetry historical excerpts tell you the actual action that's going to happen in the chapter. And what was so fun about my noticing that is, of course, if you want to talk about truly having a panic attack at a dissertation defense, I show up to my defense, and it was a day before ICFA one year. And one of my friends, Val, decided it would be nice if she brought some ICFA people down. So she drove up to Orlando, and she brought AP, who your audience may know is a Critical Dragon, and she brought Stephen Erickson to my dissertation defense. And there I was talking about Steven Erickson because I wrote a whole chapter on gardens specifically in my dissertation. And even my advisor was like, "Who is that?" I'm like, "That's Steven Erickson." He's like, "What?" I go, "Chapter 6. That's my author sitting 8 feet away from me, and I'm about to tell him about his book." And in true Erickson fashion, again, for people who don't know him, he got out of my dissertation defense, hopped on his author Facebook, was like, "Learned something new about my own book today." And he absolutely agreed with me. Like, I was like, "Oh, thank goodness." Like he could have gone like, "Just listen to some moron tell me some wrong things about me," but he's just not like that. But
Yeah.
it's an interesting way to build a world in a catalog like that. And then the fact that there are so many like red herrings in there, there's so many false lights, there's so many things in there that aren't in the actual text, that it fascinates me, right? Like, this is not in the book. Why is this in the catalog? And that's kind of what a lot of that drew me, though, and maybe this is Finney's purpose, I have no idea, but it drew me to researching those things, right? Like, if this is not in the book and it's in the catalog, he must want me to look into it. But like that unanswered question about the chimera. So I read this unanswered question, and that led me to researching chimeras. I spent days learning everything there was to learn about chimeras. It's not called a chimera, and I won't bore your audience with it, but the original kind of like legendary Asian creature that the chimera is kind of based off of, like all of this nonsense, right? And in some ways, it was a combination of chimera and Apollonius that led me to find the Temptation of St. Anthony, because St. Anthony has an entire discussion with a chimera. Like the same way that Edwin has the discussion with the sea serpent in Lao, Anthony has a discussion with the chimera in the Temptation of St. Anthony. And it's very clear to me that this is part of what Finney's trying to do, is lead me on this path. So,
is the chimera in Temptation of St. Anthony female?
Male.
Oh, okay. Okay.
It's a traditional chimera, as Finney would call it.
All right. So another thing that I was wondering when I started the book, is it reminded me of a book that I read last year. Very famous author in the genre. It reminded me of Salem's Lot a little bit by Stephen King, but just in the sort of jumping around the town at first style, only in the parade section at the beginning. And I should also make that asterisk, or make that note of, that's the only Stephen King I've read. So I can't say that it reminds me of that author, but that definite sort of looking at the town. I don't know if if King based any, or had any familiarity with Finney or anything like that.
Right. Well, I mean, I'll say I haven't run across anything that said that King had familiarity with Finney, but it would make sense to me.
Okay.
I can tell you that I know King is a big supporter and proponent of Bradbury's work.
Okay.
And since he was a fan of Bradbury, he certainly would have, I'm sure, read Finney at some point. But that kind of multiple perspective and bouncing around in one location are any of King's Derry novels.
Okay.
Right. So any King work set in or around Derry, he does it around the country with The Stand. So, I mean, we're talking about a bunch of kind of earlier King work, but even in Cell and others, the King loves that multiple perspective thing, but he'll often do it in a town. And, I think King probably does it with this idea of the fact that multiple perspectives actually give you the truth, if you will. Like, everyone's got a perspective truth, and it's only when we know all those perspectives that we have an idea about what the truth is, because we don't have a single perspective. We have all four. And even then we're going to have gaps. I think for, and I think that's a very enlightened way of kind of looking at the world. I'm not sure Finney was quite that enlightened in the 30s, based on some of the stuff that I've talked about that he did in some other places. But I do think that what he wanted to show is that, again, for me, so much of what's going on in this little story is the idea of playing with truth, right? What is truth? What is true? And how do we know it's true? It's why I coined the term and called it an epistemological fantasy when I first wrote about it. And the reason why he's got to give us those perspectives is because otherwise, like, if one person's seeing this crazy circus, it could be imagined, right? We might have an unreliable narrator. We have a cask of Amontillado situation. If 2 or 3 people, maybe it's a group hallucination, right? Maybe the town was dosed on LSD and didn't know it or something, right? But by showing us that it's the whole town and each person in the town is having kind of a slightly different response to it and reaction to it, tells us a very different thing. And I think that's part of playing with multiple perspectives, at least for Finney. Incidentally, as I say Finney, I have a cat named Finney who's currently going crazy about 10 feet away from me. I think it's because she keeps hearing her name. Like, what do you want? But so I think Finney gives us this idea of, it cements that reality early on, right? If you're, we used to talk about, like, there are some archaic, outdated terms for how we did it, but part of what we have to do early on in any fantasy work is make it real, right? Like, I don't know about you, but a number of times, kind of going back to the very first question we talked about, a number of times during my education, I had professors and other students and people I was dating pull me aside and they're like, "Why do you study this garbage? Like, why don't you read something important and talk about that?" And like, to me, like, what you're wanting me to read is garbage.
Right.
this is like, because I don't like that, right? Like, there are plenty of people who like that stuff and they'll talk about it, and goody for them. I'm going to stand over here with the weirdos and the freak show that I fit in with and have my whole life. So, but for any of us who read fantasy, kind of going back to this idea that, fantasy has its own kind of megatext that you have to ascribe to, or else readers reject you. You've got to tell me, like, I've got to get the rules of the world really early, right? I've got to get the, like, how do I know this is true? Like, you've got to prove it to me in those first pages, and how do you do that in a Circus of Dr. Lau in less than 100 pages with no info dump, right? There's no info dump in this story. There's no room for it. It's not page 3 of Neuromancer where for the next 5 pages, I'm going to tell you how the world got here. Instead, it's very like, good luck. But, he does play with some things, like he runs the ad in the newspaper. Maybe not in a post-2015 world, but before 2015, we used to trust what was written in the newspaper. And what was in the newspaper had been fact-checked and had been looked at and was not necessarily subject for debate. And even if it's an advertisement, right, we gave it a certain amount of gravitas, all right, with regard to truth, because it appeared in the paper. So the circus ad appears in the paper. And the same questions that we would have as readers are the questions being asked by the townsfolk, right? Well, how did the circus get here? Well, it didn't come in by train. I tell you that. The train guys are like, well, it didn't come in by train. It didn't come in by boat because we're in Arizona.
Right.
Like, how did it get here? And you're reading that and you almost don't even realize that Finney is toying with your head, right? Finney is like, no. These are going to be your questions. Let me show you how smart I am. I'm going to ask those questions as you're asking them in
Right.
your head. And, again, like, I mean, maybe Finney was a really lucky idiot, but I've always seen the guy kind of as a genius. And particularly with this work, like, I can't tell you that that Unholy City or Magician Out of Manchuria are as good as the Circus of Dr. Lau. They're not for me.
Okay.
The Unholy City is mostly worth a read because it's very much a response to how people review this work.
Okay.
The 4 reviews of the Circus of Dr. Lau are that it's funny, licentious, a comedic romp. All of these are direct quotes. Borderline pornography, as one called it, because it had a sex scene or an almost sex scene very early on with Agnes Birdsong, and the show she goes to. I'll leave it at that. There's a peep show in the middle. There is, there's some sexualized behavior in here, and so maybe that's because it's written by a military guy in part while he was in China, and maybe not. But that's all the reviews had to say. Like, it's fun, it's funny, it's comedic. And I think Finney was like, you missed the point. So he wrote The Unholy City in such language that no reviewer was going to get through it. Like, if anything, you made it through like 15, 20 pages. And the great conceit in The Unholy City is there's a giant, let me know if this one rings true anywhere in your head. There's a giant lizard romping through and destroying parts of the city.
Oh, yeah. That sounds
vaguely familiar, right? And I assume that is said giant lizard there on the front. Though, because I'm reading it in a post I've seen Godzilla world.
Right.
When they're like, there's a giant lizard stomping through the city, I'm like, go Godzilla, right? Like, hearing the Blue Oyster Cult in my head and seeing Godzilla moving through with laser eyes or something. And so, like, but it's like he really wanted people to find other things in the book. And, as I told other people, like, it breaks my heart that I'm not old enough to have read this and been able to write about it at a time where Finney could have seen it. I worry that the man died feeling like no one ever got his book. And I don't know that I get it fully. But I think he would have been happy that somebody tried to get it. Right? Like, here's a guy who read this book and thought, wow, I'm going to take that seriously. The other fascinating thing about the Circus of Dr. Lau is at the time that I started writing, there were either 2 or 3 academic articles on it, and none of them were more than 4 pages long. Like, all very short. Nobody seems to know quite what to do with this book. And yet, if you look, it consistently makes the top 100 fantasy books list.
Okay.
Consistently makes it. And so everybody loves it, and nobody knows why. And that's part of the puzzle for me. Is I've got all these people who love this book, because when I was doing the master's thesis for it, I found every reference printed anywhere academically and the reviews for the Circus of Dr. Lau. And I brought him to my advisor. It was like 10 things. And he's like, but where's the rest? I'm like, there is no rest. This is it. And then he did the research. He's like, yeah, that really, you found some I didn't find. I'm like, I told you that was it. And yet again, one of those references is in the 100 greatest books of fantasy. And it's, no one has laid claim to trying to explain why yet, other than me. And I'm always hoping that I'll talk about fantasy or Finney enough, or people will get so tired of hearing me talk about it that they'll start talking about it. And, I say, like, nothing written, nothing recorded. Like, I'd almost guarantee your audience that if they looked up Charles Finney on YouTube, this is the only thing that'll come up. Nothing else. No one probably ever talked about this. And I think that that really saddens me from perspective of just how great a book it is. And again, I'm biased. I love this thing. But I would love to get some people to really talk about it. Like, I'll tell you, I struggled for 6 or 7 years trying to figure out the meaning to the whole City of Woldercan episode, right? That's 5, 6 pages in the book. And years I've spent like, what is the point to this? Why? Like, what is going on? And then, like, spoiler alert, I guess, but like the scene with what happens with Yodel at the end, the great god Yodel, and then the book ends in, one of the most unsatisfying endings ever. Short of it was all a dream, which is my least favorite ending to any book. But this one ends with, then the ends of the tent fell outward and down, and the circus of Dr. Lau was over. And into the dust and the sunshine, the people of Abalone went homewards or wherever else they were going. Like, there's no resolution to anything here. Like, but to be fair, there's no real plot to this book. Like, it's a series of vignettes of people going to the circus, and each vignette has its own little plot, right? Each vignette has what's going on. And I've always felt like, is the City of Woldercan episode, that if there's an overarching theme or message to this book somewhere, that's where it should be, right? It should be in the main event. And I keep struggling with the Woldercan episode. I go back and forth. I've written a few things about it, and all of them argue with each other. And I have pages and pages of notes about it, and all of it argues with itself. And like, what are we to glean from this? What are, it's from a kind of a historical perspective. It's very much, supposed to be indicative of, I think very much a pre-Christian kind of religious ceremony. Right. Quite possibly indigenous in nature, native in some way. It reminded me of, historical accounts of ceremonies I've read from Central and South America, for example. But like, I'm not sure what the point is, right. And is part of his point, what I kind of keep coming back to, is like, he's got this appearance by, a Satan, if you will, as enemy, who's, very much addressed in Hebrew, and Apollonius banishes him. And then there's the great god Yodel, who of course doesn't exist in the historical record either. Finney invents this, as near as I can tell, anyway. And, there is an obvious kind of parallel there, right? With like different deities and these kind of, like, I'm not calling Satan a deity again for the audience, but like there's this whole idea of Christianity and perhaps of Judaism in that scene. And then there's a whole idea of pre-Christian ideas in the Yodel scene, and both end kind of unsatisfactorily, and people just go back to their daily lives. And, maybe that's Finney's kind of broad strokes discussion on religion, since he's got like, not only is he the great-great-grandson of the revivalist preacher, he's named after him. Right? Like, you're carrying this dude's name, and now you're being very antithetical to everything he stood for. And so, at least in this book, again, I don't want to upset the ancestors of Charles Finney or any of the family if I'm getting this wrong, but maybe that's the point of the Woldercan episode, that, for Finney, there wasn't a ton of value in this kind of like worship, and that it was very symbolic. And at the end of the day, your life was your life, right? Including a religious ceremony in a circus is in and of itself kind of a pretty clear message.
Right.
Yeah.
That it's entertainment, and
it's a bit on the old nose. So, that it might be entertainment. It might be designed to kind of make you feel better. But of course, nothing at Lau's Circus has made anyone feel better.
Right.
Like, everyone remains completely unsatisfied with what they want. The frat boys don't get to see the peep show. Agnes doesn't get to actually have sex with the person or thing she goes into the event with. He tells us this is coitus interruptus, right? We have, the woman who under fortune told, who hears nothing but bad news. We have a magician who conjures things, brings a man back from the dead who randomly says, "Man, I got business to tend to," and run. Like, all we know about him for sure is that he had the initials RK in the band, which I tried in vain to link to Rudyard Kipling somehow, and I just couldn't. It was the only RK I could think of who might have been in the zeitgeist in the 30s. And then I tried to find an RK in the old China Hands in case he's writing about a buddy from the military. Couldn't find it there. But no one gets really what they came for, but they all leave with something, right? They all leave with some kind of new idea, some new way of looking at the world, but not all of them follow it, right? So of the characters who walk into these vignettes, walk into these tents and have these episodes, some are changed forever. Agnes, for example, is changed forever. Says the boys said she was a lot more fun. We'll leave it at that afterwards. Which again is probably bordering on the licentious pornographic element. But it also might just be that she was more fun, like she had more passion and more zest for life after this. But then you have people who don't change. It's very interesting to me that did you catch that, like, Frank Tull is mostly machine?
He's all replaced by all of these different fake knee, all this stuff.
So it's full of all these fake things. And what I find and yet what it tells us in the catalog is described in the text a good man before a jury, right? Like that's it. That's all we learn about Tull. But he's as much machine as he is human being, and I can't help but had a mind of metal and gears, right? Like I can't help but think of Tolkien, and I'm not arguing that Tolkien was Finney. No, but what I'm saying is there's this very interesting connection there between two authors who are totally disparate, because Tull does not have a positive leaving of the circus. It doesn't change him in any way. And that perhaps part of what both authors in some ways are saying is that the more natural side of us is what's malleable. The natural side of us is what is able to learn from our experiences. And when we become mechanized, we close ourselves off to those ideas. So a mind of metal and gears, is literal for Finney and, figurative very much for Tolkien. But what you have is this ability to change. And metal at the time would have been seen as no longer malleable, as fixed in position. And, perhaps that's something both authors are hinting at. And they're kind of writing Circus Dr. Lau is written in the 30s, which is very much in line with when Tolkien's writing. And so, I wonder how much of this is part of the zeitgeist of between World War I and World War II, right? Of this idea of metal and gears and I can't help but think of the TikTok man later on, that this idea of being constantly driven by something that's not the natural world. It almost blocks us off to what we can learn, and specifically what we can learn from fantasy. That whole idea of being able to return to our world and see it in a very new light from Tolkien. And that's something. But and that's what I mean. Finney's book even kind of takes into account that not everyone's going to get anything out of it, right? If half the residents of Abalone, Arizona, who apparently attend the circus, don't get anything out of it and their lives don't change, then certainly Finney doesn't expect that even half his readers will have that happen, you know, and perhaps that's part of his message too. And that's what I mean. Like, I can keep digging. There's all this meta commentary for me in this book. And I don't know how much of that is Finney and how much of that is Dan, but whatever. Bart says it's okay that I do that. So I'm going to stick with that.
I'm a little curious how the rest of your like cohort and your peers in class responded to this on the syllabus, or like, yeah, how your take differed from theirs.
Well, I mean, sure. Like, I will say that of that graduate section, this book resonated more with me than anyone else in that section of the class. Now, I'll tell you, he ran the same class 2 years later after I graduated.
Yeah.
And when he ran that same class, he brought me in, or the next year, rather, he brought me in to talk about Finney. I ran the class on Circus of Dr. Lau. And one other person in that section wrote their thesis about Dr. Lau, specifically about, or kind of spurned on by Dr. Lau, specifically about the idea of sui generis in fantasy text, which is let's very basically call it one of its own, like one of a kind, the only example. I'm talking about The Hound of the Hedges, which is again, I'm still researching, and my knowledge of Chinese folklore is not great. But I consistently research and trying to find some reference to a being that is half vegetable and half animal, which is what he says about Hound of the Hedges, is the perfect blend of the natural. And I haven't come across anything yet, and neither did Adam White, who wrote that master's thesis. So Adam White wrote about it. I know that Dr. Jennifer Cox, who was also in that section, the section that I went in to teach it, not the one I was in, it appeared both in her, I believe in her MA thesis, but I know it figures into her dissertation, which has to do with the idea of the dark carnival and circuses. So it was part of what pushed her in that direction, you know. And so again, I say, like, this book has this odd way, right? Like, it's a little tiny book. It's seen as important. Nobody seems to know what the hell it's about. And yet a certain kind of person reads it and becomes almost a driving element in their life. In either trying to figure it out or figure out how it belongs in, you know, like, how does it fit into the development of American fantasy is something I've tried to think about forever, because arguably it doesn't, right? Like, the truth is, if Bradbury never created his like anthology that had the Circus of Dr. Lau as the lead story, it's printed as the Circus of Dr. Lau and Other Stories. If that anthology is never printed, if Bradbury doesn't do it, I never read the Circus of Dr. Lau by Charles Finney. And arguably neither does anybody else after about 1939. And so it's Bradbury we have to thank. And I'm not a Bradbury fan. Like, I've read some of his stuff, but I'm not a big fan. Not because he's not great, he's just not my cup of tea. And you know, so we have Bradbury to thank, but like, why does this book resonate with a certain type of thinker, right? Why does it resonate with a certain type of creative artist in the Bradbury Beagle kind of Gaiman, you know, maybe King line, right? And why does it resonate with certain types of academics and certain types of readers beyond academics? I've met casual readers who have read this book 10 times and, like me, kind of come back to it as a comfort. You know, like, I have a bad day and I'm like, no, I need to tune out the world. And, you know, I don't know if your viewers have this, but I have this, where sometimes I have a day where I'm like, no, I'm not dealing with the world anymore. So I'm done with the world for today. I'm going to bury myself in something else. And, you know, for a long time, I buried myself in an online gaming addiction. You know, as my kind of escape from the world. But, you know, I used certain like comfort books for that, and this is definitely one of them. I can sit down and read this book in an hour and a half and walk away. I will have made more notes in my book. One of my students at one point, I teach at the college level now, actually asked me, they're like, how have you written more pages about this book than there are pages in this book? Because I have at this point. Even my notes in the book are longer as far as word count than the actual text. Just my hand scribbled in pencil in the margins, and then on like they're like, as you could see, like they're full on note cards sticking out of here. You know, there are a ton of these large post-it notes and flags and just underlining, and it's a disaster. You know, and that's one copy. There are no handwritten notes in my signed first edition because no.
Right.
Like the fact that it's out and sitting behind me is making me a little paranoid. My wife bought me that for a gift one year, and it is a prized possession.
Nice.
Every once in a while, I think like I'm holding something that this guy held, and this is the resonation that Finney has with me. Is that, you know, he's one of, like, I've been blessed that I've met almost all of my heroes who are authors. As I mentioned, I've mentioned other people like in fantasy, like Stephen R. Donaldson, Steve Erickson, Jenny Wirtz, like I can keep going, but these are people that I've had the wonderful pleasure, Neil Gaiman, of meeting and being able to speak to. I'm born too late for Finney. So to be able to even kind of like touch something that I know he had to hold because he signed it is kind of neat for me. And I feel like it gives me this longer, deeper kind of connection. And I hope that I do get around to writing either a biography or doing a monograph about Finney someday. And I get to go to the University of Arizona, and I'm sure they'll make me put on gloves, right? But I get to go through and kind of dig through this archive like firsthand, and again, the archival librarians at the University of Arizona saved my butt because I couldn't afford to fly to Arizona as a PhD student. But to get to sit down and actually go through these archives and look at like try and figure out like what all was going on in Finney's life as he's writing these pieces. Like, can I connect this to events, or can I connect it to people that might have been, you know, orbiting him, if you will, gravitationally? And just try and figure out, like, did he know what he had written, right? Like when he wrote it, did he know that what he had written was something that would end up grabbing a Bradbury, a Beagle, a Gaiman, or a Creed, or a Cox, or a White, right? Like these are last names of people, just so everyone knows. Like, did he have any idea? And, you know, like when Bradbury did his anthology, which he does while Finney is still alive, like, did Finney think like, finally, someone's going to get it? And then no, and then got disappointed again. Like that's kind of my question. And you know, if I had had a chance to meet him, that's what I would have asked. Right? Is like, is this supposed to just be funny? You know, like every once in a while, when you read a book and you're reading so much into it, you have to think to yourself like, am I just putting all this here?
Right.
Like, is this really just like, dude, you know, when I meet Finney, he'd be like, it's a fun book about a circus.
Right.
You know, I'd be like, well, thanks. That's 20 years of my life I wasted. But, you know, I like to think that, you know, depending on someone's belief system, that if Finney has an inkling that someone's actually talking about him, that it would make him happy to know that it resonated with some people, and that his art may not have changed the world, but it changed my world for sure. So, and hopefully it changes the world for somebody else. Maybe the next amazing author that I'll want to read will see this video, pick up this little book, and be inspired.
Maybe, yeah,
Right?
maybe.
Like there's always that possibility.
Yeah.
If that's you and you're watching, it's not me that's inspiring. It's Finney. Go read Finney when this video is over. But like maybe that will happen, and maybe it will resonate, and if not, maybe it will become somebody's comfort book and get them through a bad day, or maybe they can read it and find in Agnes the ability to find a passion and a zest for life, or in Edwin a philosophical understanding of kind of what the point of existence is, or in The Fall of Wuldercan and Finney's probable disbelief in kind of a deity, maybe they'll find that it's okay to be that person.
Yeah.
If you can do that as the great-great-grandson and namesake of a revivalist preacher, then man, you can do it no matter who you are. And again, I'm not advocating for that perspective, I'm merely saying that it's a perspective people have, and a lot of times it can be hard to find a model like for that's seen as successful. And there are so many others. The ability to, the desire to know your future and to kind of, wish away your life in some ways, which I think we're often all guilty of, right?
Mhm.
Like
Yeah.
I'm sitting in South Florida and it's hot and humid and raining. And
Yeah.
I'm like, man, I can't wait for summer to be over. And
Right.
every year I do that, and I think to myself, this is not a good idea. I'm wishing away like 25% of my life every year. Like, I feel like a Green Day song, "Wake Me When September Ends,"
Right.
because then I'll be able to go outside again.
Yeah.
And that's in that, or in The Conjuring, like. This man is brought back from the dead in a very Lazarus style scene. I believe he was killed by a werewolf, is what
Yeah.
is in my head now. And he wakes up and he's just like, I got business to attend to, and runs out of the tent, and maybe that's part of Finney telling us, like, hey, work shouldn't be your whole life. You could get mauled by a werewolf tomorrow. Like, I don't know. But I think that it's one of those books that, because of the vignette style, right? Because of the lack of one overarching narrative and one overarching theme, that if you look for it, there's something in it for almost everybody, and because the writing style is lighthearted, because it is an absolutely uproariously funny book.
Yeah.
Like, if you read this book and you don't laugh at some point, then we have very different senses of humor.
Yeah.
Because I can't get through this book without laughing a few times. And sometimes it's very dad humor, pun jokes. And other times it's like, oh my goodness, like this is hilarious. And then the catalog itself is funny for all the right reasons. And that's how I guess I would sell the book if I had to, right? Like, why should I read this book? Which, I often feel like is kind of a question that I'd want to find in a video, something like this one. And it's because whether you find it or not, there's something in it for you.
Yeah.
And the very act of not finding it means that there's something in it for you, because half the city of Abalone doesn't find anything in it.
Yeah.
And it's a great taste test for, am I going to like fantasy at all?
Right.
Right.
Yeah.
Like, can you buy into the philosophical discussion, the philosophical perspective of a sea serpent so large it can encircle the earth, and learn something from it? And if you're okay with that sea serpent being able to have a rational discussion at a philosophical level, you're ready for fantasy.
Yeah.
Like, you're ready for almost anything. And if you're like, what is this garbage? Why is this snake talking? It's okay. Stick with us through the Circus of Dr. Lau and find those in different types of text. And, at least from me, like, judgment free. I know people who love all kinds of, like, they love realism, they love true crime. Like, I can't be bothered with that. Like, that's just not my cup of tea. You couldn't pay me to read it. You're like, Dad, a year's salary if you get through this true crime novel. I'd be like, I don't think I can make it.
Nope.
Like, I think I'll just teach. And I don't even teach fantasy and science fiction literature. I teach business writing. So it goes to show you can have very kind of distinct sides of your life.
Mhm.
So.
All right. Well, I don't want to keep you too long. So I don't really have any more specific questions, if that's all right. I think we've been doing a couple 2.5 hours or so. So who knows? I could cut this in half, but maybe whoever's still watching now, if you've tuned in to watch in the first place, you'll probably watch through the whole thing. So
maybe.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, and what I'll say is, I'm a subscriber to your content. And so I will, I'm just there under my real name because I'm not a YouTube person, personality person. I do.
Not yet.
I'll leave that to y'all. Y'all are our age. But I will kind of look around, and if someone has specific questions about Finney and either wants to contact you and have me pop back in for maybe a shorter version for these people.
Sure,
like a 10 or 15 minute I'll do like a Q&A with some of the stuff asked, or if I see it in comments, I'll pop in and try and answer. But I just show up as Daniel Creed on YouTube.
Okay.
So don't be looking for some fancy name like Finney Lover One. No, I'm just I'm boring and old enough that I was on the internet before really having an ulterior name was not a thing.
Right.
We were just like, I'm Dan. We didn't even think to lie because we didn't know who any of these people were. What I commonly tell people is when I first got on the internet, there were no search engines. That's how long I've been online. Search engines didn't exist. You had to know the URL address of what you wanted to see. And it was in a book. It was a large book full of the URL addresses for different companies and locations. The Green Book, I don't remember. It's been years. It was the very, very mid 80s, if you will. But really, and in case you can't tell, I have a blast talking about Finney. And
you too. I have a blast listening to your insights, and and talking. I love this.
And like if there's interest and people really want, then we can always do this again, and we can go vignette by vignette.
Oh, sure. Okay. Yeah.
And I'll go through, and you could whether we do that as one video or you want to cut them up, right?
Okay. Yeah.
This is that. Or we could do it with chapter designations. So if people were only really interested in Apollonius's magician, boom, they can click on that, go to that specific chapter, and watch what they want. Because as I said, I'm a big believer that different vignettes will speak to different people. So, but I'm grateful to have been able to come on here and I guess preach the gospel of Finney. And at least talk about it in a positive way and have some content somewhere for as long as content exists about Finney that's on record. And I hope it leads to some interesting discussions amongst people.
Yeah, it'll probably take people longer to watch this video than to read the Circus of
I guarantee it. Depending on how much of my rambling you have to cut out to keep your audience around, it will take longer to watch the video than to read the book. Really, folks, here, I'll do the bottom because there are no notes. That's the entirety of the book. Okay. You're if you're not a reader, I'm not sure you're necessarily on here, but including the catalog, that's 154 pages. And it's not that tiny script, right? It's big text. You can really sit down and read this book in an hour and a half. And I'd love to see you do it, if for no other reason than from a very selfish perspective. Maybe if a bunch of people buy this book, someone will want to print an annotated version, and I'll write it. So Thank you again, Alex. This has been a blast, and I've had a good time.
Thank you so much. Bye.
Bye.